Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's video lecture. It's all about Impressionism this week. Impressionism is a really interesting time in music, and I think it gets overlooked a lot because it doesn't take up the same amount of space as some of the other larger periods. It's almost seen as like a micro version of what some of the other stylistic periods are, just because not all composers during this time were observing this style, which is normal in the other stylistic periods. But with Impressionism in particular, it really sticks out because even though this was like a small period of time, this style has become really influential in everything that came after it. So even though it's not like a style that lasted 100 years. In fact, it was only about 50 years. It still had a huge impact, and so I thought it was worth taking the time to look it over. So in our last lesson, we covered the Romantic period, which lasted roughly from 1820 to 1900. So you'll notice that there's some overlap. I label the Impressionist period as starting in 1874 and lasting to 1926, and so there is some overlap here. So this was going on kind of towards the end of the Romantic period. The Romantic period was an era characterized by storytelling, freedom, drama. You saw the rise of nationalism during that time, as there was many different composers around the world who were trying to find the cultural identities of their particular countries and figuring out ways to express that in music. And during the Romantic period, we saw huge, giant, very influential composers like Chopin and Wagner and Beethoven, who wrote these huge virtuosic masterworks that are still widely performed today. Romantic music is very well established in the concert repertoire of all the major orchestras around the world. And so that's what we're coming from. And so this is kind of, if we see artistic periods as usually responses to what has come just before them, we can see the Impressionist period as a response to this kind of larger than life, hyper dramatic, super just very big style of music that was in the Romantic period. I like to think of like the Romantic period being like superhero movies, how they're just like huge, big budget affairs where there's explosions all over the place and like it's just this amazing stuff happening. It's like a spectacle. And the Impressionist period is a lot more dialed back from that. It's probably like some, smaller budget indie film, which still has a lot to contribute and a lot of great message and meaning, but it's just much more subdued than the Romantic period. So, Impressionism. This is the first period we've studied so far that overlaps with another one, as I mentioned earlier. It bridges the Romantic era and the 20th century, and again, I really wanted to include it because I think it has its own unique philosophy, and I think it's important to understand the Impressionist period so that you can have a better perspective when we do move into the 20th century about some of the trends that come up during that time. Impressionist composers, some of the most influential of which were Spanish and French, rejected the programmatic Germanic influences of the Romantic period and chose to embrace more ambiguous atmospheric sensibilities of the French art style. So you can think that on the continent of Europe, the Germanic tradition and some of the Italian traditions had been huge for a couple hundred years at this point, and they were kind of all the rage. And so the more subdued styles of the French and the Spanish in art thought, we need to kind of make our own claim here. And so we see kind of a big juxtaposition. Impressionist music can be characterized by a broader tone palette, use of new scales, which we will look at here in just a few minutes, utilizing a broader portion of instruments' ranges. So we see composers using the extremes of an instrument to dramatic effect, so to create kind of unique tone colors. Maybe they use the low end of a flute's range, which is pretty uncommon. Flutes are a high-pitched instrument, and composers typically use them to play the high notes. But you do get very unique tone colors when you kind of use these parts of the instrument's range that aren't typically used. We see an increased use of percussive instruments. Unresolved cadences is a big thing, so there's lots of like tension that is just kind of left to be tense. There's not always resolution. Unusual chord combinations, a lack of a tonal center, and kind of hazy topics. Focus on evoking mood rather than telling a story. As you remember, in the Romantic period and the Germanic tradition, it was really big to have these grand stories. There were the idea of program music, which was you were trying to tell a story by using music. And like if the person knew the story and they listened to the music, they could kind of follow along with the narrative. The Impressionists wanted to get away from that a little bit. They were all about mood. They weren't about telling you a step-by-step story. They were rather about like creating a vibe. I think it's important to think about some of the Impressionist visual artists as a way to understand Impressionist music. So I thought we should talk briefly about Claude Monet. Claude Monet was a French painter and father of the Impressionist movement. His 1872 painting Impression Sunrise is often cited as the beginning of the Impressionist movement. Impressionism is characterized by art that utilizes thin brushstrokes to create these blurry yet evocative images. So when you look at this picture kind of here, in one way when you look at it, it's not very lifelike, it's not very photorealistic, but when you stand back from it and you kind of like begin to look at the ways that he plays with light and reflection, and the ways that all of these little strokes, even though they're not perfectly blended together, how they kind of come together to create kind of a more hazy, moody feeling of what he's trying to portray. An impressionist is less focused on the details of a work and more focused on the mood that it creates. Impressionists are more concerned with the impression that the work gives the viewer. So it can have quite an impact even if it's not photorealistic. And so that's one thing, again, there's this sense of being hazy, this sense of kind of blurred lines, fuzzy edges, rather than kind of the stark photorealism of the previous periods. So, some of the ways that we begin to evoke these fuzzy images and fuzzy ideas in music is with some new scales. So in an effort to throw off the diatonic confines of the Romantic era, Impressionists begin to utilize new scales in music. The most prevalent of these are the chromatic, the pentatonic, and the whole tone scales. So we know, before we get into these new scales, that so much of our music, since kind of Guido of Arezzo, has been based on the 7-tone diatonic major scale. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and then do at the top. So if you include both the do's, you get 8 tones. But over time, composers started to divide this 7-note scale up in many different ways. And so rather than just having those 7 notes, one of the ways they divided up was with the chromatic scale. And so if you divided the octave into 12 even parts, which is the same as pressing every note white and black on the keyboard from one octave to the next, then you get something that sounds like this. Which is a whole lot different than... So each one is basically evenly divided into these 12 available pitches. And so when you start to do stuff like that, and you start to not have one preferenced over the next, that becomes really important when we get into the 20th century and we start to see things like atonal music. But a lot of, during the Impressionist period, chromaticism was used as, again, a way to kind of create music that was more blurry than what we had seen before. Another big one was the pentatonic scale. So again, you have the 7 pitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the octave 8 of the major scale. But some composers started to say, what if we only use 5 of those 7? So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what if we only use 1, 2, 3, 5, 6? So you have something like this. And then if you start to combine those into chords, you can get music that kind of sounds like this. The pentatonic scale has been used across cultures a lot in folk music. There's a particular kind of tension and like pleasantness to the sounds of the first, second, third, fifth, and sixth scales degrees. But so you can create all kinds of kind of interesting, really pleasing sounds just by using those 5 notes. There's a major pentatonic and a minor pentatonic version as well. And several variations. And then the final one, which became really popular as well, was the whole tone scale. So again, instead of playing the 7 notes of the major scale, what if, and by the way, the major scale is a kind of mix of different whole steps and half steps to create the scale. But what if instead of mixing whole steps and half steps, what if we only used whole steps? And so this is what's pictured over here to the right. So it makes a 6-note scale that sounds like this. And so you kind of, you might recognize this from like, I don't know, dream sequences or something. It's used a lot in like TV or movies when they're representing someone going into like a trance or something. But again, using whole tone scale is a unique way to create music and to start to transform some of your melodic material that you'd come up with. And so these 3 scales had really big impacts on the music of the time. One of the composers that's most identified today with the Impressionist period is Claude Debussy. Claude Debussy is one of the most popular Impressionist composers. As a passionate child, he entered the Paris Conservatory when he was only 10 years old. And at 22, he won the Prix de Rome, which is kind of still to this day one of the most prestigious musical composition prizes that someone can win. Often criticized by his instructors for his unconventional style, Debussy was a strong-minded and emotional composer, and his letters and diary entries detail the experiences of a highly thoughtful but often depressed man. If you're ever looking for some good bedtime reading, some of his writings are really interesting, kind of give you a look into this man who wrote such great music. He really embraced what at the time they called exoticism, which is a very outdated term, which I think would be quite frowned upon to be used today, and I don't think is a very politically correct term. But basically, I think what Debussy meant when he talked about exoticism was he was talking about music and styles from other parts of the world. So there's a story about during one of the World's Fairs in Paris about Debussy and other composers kind of hearing these unique sounds from musical groups from around the world, and he began to take these sounds that he was hearing and to incorporate them into the music that he was writing. Debussy is remembered today for his moody output for orchestras, chamber ensembles, piano, and choir, as well as for his opera, Pelléas et Mélisande, and his ballet, Kama. But mostly, I would say, a lot for his orchestral works and piano especially. Just really kind of, when you think of Impressionism, this is the guy that you think about. It's funny, though, because Debussy during his time rejected the term of Impressionist whenever he was called it. He claimed that he was simply trying to do something different, and that he thought that the critics were fools or imbeciles, is what he said, for calling him an Impressionist. He thought that they were missing the point. European music up until the Impressionist period had been largely based on tertian chords, which are chords that were built on thirds. So we heard chords that had a root. Oops. Sorry, let me get my keyboard working. Had a root, a third, a fifth, and a seventh. And so this was kind of typical sounds that we might hear. And so at most in a single chord you might have 4 different pitches going on. But as time went on, composers like Debussy and others began to continue to stack thirds on top of the thirds that were already there. So we have a root, third, fifth, seventh, and then what if we add a few more? So what if we add the next third, which would be the 9th, and the 11th, and the 13th? Then we have this much more complex chord than before. Here's just the 7th, and here's the 13th, with the 3 extra pitches. This plays a lot into jazz music that we see later. You are going to get kind of these really unique chords that just stack thirds on top of each other to create these really complex harmonies. And it's a kind of was birthed during this time to begin stacking all these thirds on top of each other. The only kind of difficulty with these is they do tend to create a bit more of a hazy sound. So the more pitches that are added there, it can be sometimes more difficult to find a good transition into your next chord because there's already so many pitches involved that it might not feel as dramatic of a cadence when you move to your next chord. However, it does create kind of what the Impressionists was all about, which was this very interesting mood, this very interesting feeling, because that's definitely more interesting to hear than just this. It has more life, it has more what we'd call tone color. These new harmonies offered composers new opportunities to create more complex sonic atmosphere for the listener. And so these type of stacked chords with additional notes, 9ths and 11ths and 13ths and so on, we start to see more and more. During the Impressionist era, a lot of the composers kind of rejected some of the titles that we heard in previous eras. So we don't really have so many symphonies, number whatever, or concerto in G, or a fugue, or sonata for violin, or whatever. But we do have some kind of other terms that get used. So like prelude, nocturne, which is like a piece of music that's supposed to evoke the night or feelings of dusk. Jig, which is kind of one of the traditional Renaissance dances. A ballad or a ballade, and then tone poems as well. They never call them tone poems when you hear one. That's often kind of a classification of just like a style of writing. Tone poems were a symphonic work in a single movement which illustrates the contents of a poem. I believe I have one linked at the end that you guys can listen to. I think it's by list. And then another thing I wanted to point out about the Impressionist period was this idea of furniture music. And for me, this idea of furniture music really solidifies what the period was all about. So furniture music is music that is written to furnish an environment with a particular mood, and the French composer Eric Satie coined this term. I think he would have called it musique d'ameublement, but my French is terrible, so maybe not. So rather than meant to be like listened to and like as the focal point of an environment, this music was meant to kind of be background music. You can imagine up until this point in history, oops, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that, my phone went off. You can imagine up until this time in history, kind of getting to see music or hear music was a unique experience. Getting to listen to music was not something that you would necessarily get to do every day. I can't just sync up to Spotify and hear my favorite song. I would have to, get a bunch of organized musicians around to play me a piece of music if I wasn't particularly gifted at an instrument myself. And so the idea that music could be background noise wasn't as popular as it is today, because if you got the opportunity to hear it, you'd probably really want to focus in on it. But when Satie came along, he thought to himself, well, what if there were music for particular instances? Some of the music that he wrote was for like the arrival of a guest. He wrote music for if you were having a lunch at a cafe. He wrote music that was supposed to go in the background in someone's library, or in a officer in the Army's office. And so these were all very specific musics for very specific places. And I like this idea of kind of background music, because the music wasn't there to be the focal point. Instead, it was there to evoke a mood. And so I think that really speaks to the idea of the Impressionist period. It was all about mood. It was all about kind of creating a very specific space when using music. This is linked here, one of the 5 short pieces that Satie ever wrote, and he like explicitly said these are furniture music. But over time, many people have come to see a great deal of Satie's catalog as kind of exemplifying this idea of furniture music, of music meant to furnish a space. Some of our key terms are here that we've gone over. These are very important, and they will be on your quiz. And then some listening examples. So a lot of Debussy on here, some Ravel, Satie's on there. I put Respighi, so that's the tone poem that I put here. So that's a really great one. As always, if you have any questions or concerns or thoughts, please don't hesitate to email me, kyle.berry@hdtc.edu. And I hope you guys have a great week.